The majority of Europeans no longer identify as Christian. They no longer attend church. And a very small number are active Christian believers. Across Europe today, there are 522 million people, and only 18 million are evangelical believers. That's just 2.5%. People's governing ideology is postmodernism and secularism rather than Christianity. Many are ignorant of the gospel. They have no idea what Christianity is about. But they do have prejudices against Christianity. They know that in the past their countries were Christian. And they think that Christianity has been abandoned and rejected because it didn't work. Or they think that Christianity has been proven to be false. It's as relevant to them as the religions of ancient Rome that have now vanished. They think that society and understanding has moved on. They think that Christianity is unbelievable, that only people of limited intelligence would be Christians. And they think that Christianity is intolerant and dangerous, perhaps promoting bigotry and discrimination against minority groups, perhaps particularly those in the lesbian, gay, and transsexual community. So they have a prejudiced view about Christianity and a negative view about Christianity. And they may know very few real Christians. Real Christianity has become marginal. And often the majority of Christians are amongst the populations of people who are very poor or refugees. It's a small section of the population that identify as Christian. They think that that society has been liberated from the moral restriction of Christianity, particularly with the sexual revolution. So they associate Christianity with restriction and not freedom. People are not afraid of death. They think that either when you die, that's the end, so why worry about it? Or they think that when you die, if there's a benevolent spiritual force, you will go to be somewhere better. They do not believe that there is a judgment after death, and there is the possibility of eternal punishment. So they are not concerned about the wrath and judgment of God, which is, of course, at the very heart of what the Christian message is all about: salvation from God's coming judgment. So they don't think they need the Christian message. In that context, in many of our countries, the growth of the church is very slow. There are very few conversions, and the numbers of people becoming Christians in many countries are no more than about a 1% growth rate. So we're ministering in a post-Christian culture in which people have abandoned Christianity. Christianity is not something which is new and fresh. They think Christianity is something old and abandoned. And that presents challenges in our evangelism. That is certainly true of my country in the United Kingdom. It's true of most of Western Europe. And it seems that it's also increasingly true of much of Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, after the fall of communism, there was a period of great openness to the gospel. But it seems that very quickly secularism has taken the place of Christianity, even in Eastern European countries. So even those countries have become very recently post-Christian. And I think there are particular challenges bringing the gospel to a post-Christian culture, because we have to both overcome people's prejudices and also preach the good news of the gospel to them. Now, that is the challenge that we face, but we must not lose heart, because we can still have complete confidence in the gospel message. At various times in church history, Christians have faced deep challenges to preach and explain the gospel. That's not new. And we need to have confidence in the gospel. God is sovereign. Jesus has been risen from the dead and is ruling and reigning at the right hand of God. The gospel is true because it is based on objective events. The gospel is about Jesus, who he is and what he's done. Jesus is God who came into our world. He died for sins. He is risen from the dead. He is ascended and reigning. And it doesn't matter whether people believe that or not. It is true no matter how many people believe. The gospel does not depend on people's feelings and whether they believe the gospel or not. We need to have confidence in the gospel message as true. And we need to have confidence that that gospel message is still God's power for salvation. God still saves people through the good news of Jesus. In fact, that's the only way that God saves people. The way people are saved is by hearing the good news about Jesus and believing and trusting that message. And every person who is a Christian has become a Christian because they've heard the gospel and they've believed and they've trusted. So we must still have confidence in the gospel. We don't need a new message just because we're in a post-Christian context. The gospel is still the power of God. And people still need the gospel. They may not realize it, but people were created in the image of God to know God. God has made them to know him. The gospel is the answer to their real needs. And the gospel also speaks to people's felt needs. In a post-Christian culture, people have needs and desires. They want significance. They want freedom. And those needs are ultimately met in the gospel. They want to have a secure identity. And that is ultimately met in Jesus. So we need to have confidence that the gospel is true, the gospel is powerful, and the gospel is the message that people need to hear because it will meet their real needs. Unless we have those convictions, we will not be effective in our post-Christian context. So we are in a post-Christian context and we can have confidence in the gospel. But how do we communicate that gospel in our situation? I would love to say that there was some easy and simple technique for meeting the challenges of post-Christian Europe, but I don't think there is. Actually, we have to do simply what the Bible has always told Christians to do. There is no new, different answer to the challenge of gospel ministry in a post-Christian context. There isn't something new that we need that we're missing. We need to have confidence in doing what God has told us to do. And I want to suggest there are three things we need to be committed to that are hugely important, that they're simple, they're not new, but I think they're crucial. The first of those is that we need committed prayer. We need committed prayer. We need to remember that the work of the gospel, the proclamation of the gospel, is part of a spiritual battle. We are engaged in a spiritual battle, not just a cultural or an intellectual battle. We're reminded in Ephesians chapter 6 that that is the world in which we live. There is a spiritual battle between God and the forces of evil. The work of the gospel is ultimately God's work and not our work. The people who are lost have been blinded by Satan to the truth of the gospel. They are dead in their trespasses and sins, and they are blind. And it requires a miracle for their eyes to be opened, for them to be brought to new life, and to be brought to new birth. We must never forget that evangelism is firstly a spiritual battle. And therefore we must pray for God to be at work. It's not just about our techniques. It's not just about being better able to explain the gospel or do apologetics. We need to be crying out to God to work to bring dead people to life so that they believe and trust in Jesus. Proclaiming the gospel needs to be accompanied and is dependent upon praying for the gospel. And we find that emphasis all the way through the New Testament. So in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, Paul asks the Christians that he's writing to pray. He says, pray that the gospel will spread rapidly and be honoured. More literally, he says, pray that the gospel will win and be victorious. It's an image and a picture taken from an Olympic race. It's a prayer for the triumph and the success of the gospel. Paul's whole ministry was dependent upon prayer. Paul wrote to the Christians that he wrote his letters to, and every time he asks them to pray for him and to pray for his ministry. In letters like Colossians and Ephesians, he prays for them that God would give opportunity to speak the gospel, and he prays that God would give him the ability to preach the gospel clearly and boldly. Paul realized that he needed prayer. He also urged for prayer that the gospel would come with conviction and power. So as we face the challenge of communicating the gospel in a post-Christian culture, we need to start by praying. Praying for the success of the gospel. Praying for opportunities to preach the gospel. Praying for people to preach the gospel clearly. Praying for courage to preach the gospel. Praying for people to be convinced and converted by the gospel. Very often in the past, great movements of revival and gospel growth started with prayer and continued with prayer. One of the things that's encouraging me in my country is more and more churches that are praying for the work of the gospel, and churches that are praying together for the gospel. So prayer meetings are becoming more common. Churches are meeting together to pray for their towns and their cities, for the gospel to go out. So I think prayer is essential for communicating the gospel, and if we want to see more and more people coming to know Jesus. So committed prayer. Secondly, we need to have contextualized proclamation. We need contextualized proclamation of the gospel. Evangelism is always about the proclamation of the gospel. The gospel is a verbal message about Jesus, who he is and what he's done. And we need to preach that message, to share that message, to proclaim that message to people. And the gospel message itself never changes. But the context in which the gospel is preached is always changing. And we need to therefore make sure that we are preaching the gospel in the most effective way that connects with the people that we're living amongst. We need to understand their context so that we preach the gospel in a relevant way to them. Now that means at least two things, two ways in which we need to contextualize. Firstly, it means that we need to make sure that we go to people with the gospel. When our cultures were Christian, we could expect that people would come to the church. In a Christian culture, going to church was relatively normal, and people would go to church and feel comfortable in church. And we could expect that they would come to church meetings, church services, and that we would be able to share the gospel with them in church, and they might become Christians. In a post-Christian culture, people are much less likely to come to church. They find church an alien environment. In many cases, it would never cross their mind to go to a church. So we can't keep expecting that people will come onto our territory. We need to be those who go to where people are with the gospel. In the Bible, the word mission means sent. And as Christians, we need to rediscover that we have been sent to the lost. Our job is to go to them and to then proclaim the good news of the gospel to them. And that means that we need to make sure that we are engaging with the people around us who are not Christians, who will never ordinarily come to church. So in 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter urges the Christians to live such good lives amongst the pagans. If we're not amongst the pagans, how will we be able to have opportunity to share the gospel with them? So Christians in the church need to go where people are. And that means we need to remove any unnecessary barriers to the gospel. Jesus was willing to go to people who were lost, who needed the gospel, even when the religious authorities told him he should keep separate from them. Jesus would go to the sinners, he would go to the tax collectors, he would go to those who were immoral, he would go to those who were sick, in order to share the good news of the gospel with them. The religious authorities said that he should be keeping himself pure and separate. But Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor. It's the sick who need a doctor, and I've come to seek and save the lost. So Jesus would associate with those who were not Christians. Sometimes we as Christians have been too afraid of going to those who are non-Christians in case we get contaminated. But we need to go to where people are. And we need to make sure we don't set up cultural barriers that keep them from being able to meet with us and that keep them from trusting in Jesus. So Paul in 1 Corinthians talks about how he was willing to be very culturally flexible to reach all people. Paul said that he was willing to become all things to all men so that he might win some. So Paul says that he's willing to become like a Jew to the Jews. In order to reach Jewish people, he was prepared to keep the food laws, observe the Sabbaths and the festivals, so that he had opportunity to engage with people who were Jewish who needed the gospel. But then he would go to the Gentiles. And when he went to the Gentiles, he was happy to eat anything. He didn't feel he needed to keep the Sabbaths. He met them on their terms, on their territory. Paul was totally flexible in order to be able to go to people. I think we as Christians need to be willing to do the same. We need to make very clear that being a Christian doesn't require you to dress in a certain way, to speak in a certain way, to have a certain kind of level of education. We can easily set up cultural barriers that keep people from the gospel. And we need to overcome those barriers. One of the challenges is of a post-Christian culture, particularly a plural culture, as we have in many European countries, is that there are many different cultures. And we have to be flexible to be able to reach all of those different cultures. So we need to be able to go to where people are. But secondly, we need to be able to explain and proclaim the gospel in relevant ways, ways that connect with them. The gospel never changes. But people have different beliefs, different misunderstandings, and we need to make sure that we proclaim the gospel in a way that connects and that they can understand. And again, we see that happening all the way through the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, it records many different evangelistic sermons that are preached. And they're preached in different contexts. Sometimes the preaching is to a Jewish audience. Sometimes the preaching is to a Gentile or pagan audience. What's very striking is that in all of those sermons, the same gospel is proclaimed in different ways. So when Paul or Peter are speaking to a Jewish audience, they generally talk about the law and the history of Israel, and they say to the people that they're speaking to that they've broken the law, and that because they've broken the law and rejected Jesus, they're under judgment and need forgiveness. So their gospel presentation is based on the Bible, the Old Testament law, and sin is explained as the way the people have broken the law. And that's relevant for them. When Paul preaches the gospel to pagans, for example in Athens, he preaches the gospel in a different way. He doesn't start with the Bible. He doesn't refer to the law. Instead, he talks about the Creator God who made everything. And he talks about sin as the idolatry that people have practiced. And he says that they have been foolish for thinking that God lives in temples and that he needs human beings to provide him with food. He says they've sinned, but they've sinned by their idolatry. Can you see the difference? Two different contexts, and the same message is preached in different ways. In fact, through all the sermons in the book of Acts, they have common features. In every sermon in the book of Acts, Jesus is proclaimed to be Lord. That's the heart of the gospel message. Jesus is the Lord. He's the king and the ruler. Jesus is proclaimed as the judge. He's the one who ultimately is going to come and judge the world and every person. And people are warned that their sin deserves judgment, whether that be they've broken the law or whether it's that they have committed idolatry. And then in the light of that, Paul urges people to repent and believe, to receive forgiveness. It's the same message. Jesus is Lord. Jesus is coming as judge. Therefore, you need to repent and believe in order to escape the judgment and receive salvation and forgiveness. But that same message is preached in different ways. And what we need to do as we preach in our post-Christian context is that we need to make sure that we preach the gospel in ways that are relevant and appropriate to the people that we're speaking to. We need to understand, what is it they believe about God? What is it they believe about the world? How does the gospel challenge their wrong beliefs? How does the gospel confirm some of the things that they are looking for? So we need to make sure that we preach the gospel in an appropriate way. Most will have no Christian background. Most won't know the Bible well. So we perhaps have to speak more in the way that Paul did to the people of Athens, speaking about how God has created the world. And if there's a God who's created the world, then surely we are accountable to him. So we need to try to find ways in which we apply the gospel in a way that's appropriate to people's lives, in a way that fulfills their desires and aspirations, but also confronts their sin. So we need to be asking, what are the barriers to Christian belief of the people that we're sharing the gospel with? So, for example, we might need to show them that the gospel leads to true freedom, the real freedom that they want. We might need to show that it's the gospel that leads to a secure identity, so that you can know who you really are. That the gospel leads to real justice in society. So the gospel answers the concerns that people have. And we need to make sure that the gospel is answering the prejudices that people have that stop them believing. Tim Keller, the American pastor and evangelist, has talked about what he calls defeater beliefs. There are certain beliefs that people have in our culture that stop them trusting in Jesus. They're what they think are the knockdown arguments that mean I would never be a Christian. We need to think about what those arguments are, because they're different in different cultures. And we need to make sure that our gospel preaching addresses those problems. So in a post-Christian culture, one of the great defeater beliefs is that people think Christianity in the past was a bad thing. They think Christianity was oppressive and restrictive. And I think one of the things that we can communicate to people and tell people is the wonderful history of how Christianity has contributed to contemporary culture. Christians in history have made massive contributions to education, to economic equality. Contemporary human rights flow from Christian thinking. We have a great story to tell about the good impact the gospel has had. And that might be part of the way we answer people's objections to Christianity, to overcome some of that prejudice. In sort of some Eastern European and Southern European countries, the main background, the main belief that people have might be still a kind of an atheistic belief, or for others it might be Catholicism or their orthodoxy. And we need to make sure that we preach the gospel in a way that addresses their sort of beliefs and convictions, their religious background. And increasingly in many parts of Europe, it may well be people from other religious groups like the Muslim community. And we'll need to preach the gospel differently to those who come from a Muslim background. It means we need to keep thinking creatively about what is the best way to proclaim the gospel. We don't today, or wouldn't today, preach the gospel in the same way as Billy Graham. Billy Graham was preaching the gospel to a particular culture at a particular moment. We preach the same gospel, but in a different context. And sometimes our ministry and our church's evangelism is not effective, not because we're not faithfully preaching the gospel, but because we haven't thought about the need to contextualize the gospel and to preach it at this moment. So, contextual proclamation. And lastly, the last thing that is crucial is what I will call the corroborating proof of local church life. I'm a lawyer by background. I don't know if you know the idea of what corroboration is. If you're trying to present evidence, you might have a main piece of evidence, but then you want to introduce what we call corroboration. That is extra evidence that proves your case. Do you understand what I mean? And the main proof for Christianity in the gospel is the fact that Jesus is risen and alive. That's at the heart of the gospel message. But the life of the local church ought to confirm or corroborate the truth of the gospel. Christianity is not just about individual salvation. It's about God's plan to save a people for himself. God is seeking to bring about a new creation, a whole new society. And that work begins in the life of the church. And I think we need to recapture an understanding that the local church is meant to be the advert for Jesus. The local church is meant to be the place where the new life in Jesus can be seen, where the transforming power of the gospel is evident. Put it another way, the church is meant to be the shop window of the kingdom of God. People are meant to be able to look into the church and in its collective corporate life see what happens when people live for Jesus. The church shows that the gospel is true. In a sense, it's the new community, it's the taste of heaven on earth. And this is, of course, what Jesus said. Jesus said to his disciples, "By this all men will know that you are my disciples, that you love one another." It's the mutual love that people have for one another in the church that is meant to be the advert for the gospel, that displays the love of Jesus at work. Many people are put off Christianity because they are put off by the church. And in our post-Christian context, that is an increasing problem, particularly as there are more and more stories of abuse in the history of the church, and particularly stories of child abuse in the history of the church. That has damaged the work of the gospel in many countries because people are put off Christianity. And one of the ways that we can counteract that is by the vibrant life of our churches. Our churches need to be communities of love, where people from all different backgrounds who trust in Jesus are accepted and welcomed. They need to be communities of honesty and authenticity. We need to make sure that our churches are not places of hypocrisy. They need to be places of grace. It's in the church that we ought to see broken people being healed and restored. The church is not a gathering of better people, but of broken people who are experiencing Jesus' salvation. The church needs to be a community of forgiven people who admit to their failure but have sought God's forgiveness. They need to be places full of people who have been redeemed, not who are self-righteous. They need to be a place where there is genuine care for one another, where vulnerable people are cared for, where elderly people are cared for, where lonely people are cared for. The life of the church will commend, corroborate the truth of the gospel. And that was the case in the life of the early church. In the Roman period, when the Christians were a tiny group in a hostile society, the Christians were known for their love for one another and the way that they cared for people. The Romans could see that it was the Christians who cared for the poor, for the slaves, for the women, for the sick, in a way that they didn't. And that made the church very attractive to people in society. So if we're going to be effective in bringing the gospel again to a post-Christian context, I think it's very important that we make sure our churches are those communities of love that will corroborate the gospel, that will be a shop window for Jesus. That's why it's so important that our churches reject compromise and sin. Yes, it's right that they are communities of forgiven sinners, but they also need to be communities of purity. And they need to reject false teaching that denies the gospel. So those, I think, are three very important things for ministering in a post-Christian context. And in many ways, they're essential for every context. We need to be committed to prayer. We need a contextual proclamation. And we need the corroborating proof of the life of the local church. And I want to say that over Christian history, where those three things have happened, in God's mercy, the church has grown. Very often it has grown slowly, and it has sometimes taken hundreds of years for a culture to be transformed. But where those things have been done, there has been slow, steady gospel growth. That's what happened in the early period of the Roman Empire, when the church was tiny. It took about 250 to 300 years for the church to grow and eventually become the common religion of the Roman Empire. But the reason that that happened is because this is how the Christians lived. They prayed, they contextualized the gospel, and the church was a community, an attractive community that drew people to Jesus. One of the privileges of my job is to visit lots and lots of churches. And I love speaking to people after services and asking them how they became Christians. The vast majority of people have a very similar story to tell about how they became a Christian. It's some sort of, the majority of people, it goes something like this. I had a friend who was a Christian. And I got to know them, and I thought there was something a bit different about them. They started telling me about their faith and telling me about Jesus. I was intrigued. Then they invited me to go to church. I wouldn't normally go to church, but because they're my friend, I went along. And it wasn't what I expected at all. Actually, the people there were really nice. And I found myself going back. And then I did a course that explains what the Christian message is about. Or I went going for a number of months and I was kind of listening to the sermons, and I gradually began to understand what they were saying about Jesus. And then at some point I realized that I needed to become a Christian. That is very often the story of lots of people who've become Christians in a post-Christian context. It was the result of praying, a contextually appropriate proclamation of the gospel, and the life of the church community commending the gospel message. We face a massive challenge in Europe to bring the gospel back to a post-Christian context. We need to have confidence in the gospel. It hasn't changed, and it's still God's power. And there's no magic answer. There's no new thing we need to do. We just need to keep doing these things that Christians have always done when they've sought to communicate the gospel. We need to pray, we need to contextualize, and we need the life of the church to back up the gospel witness that we have.